The man never bought anything. He just left a bag of oranges in aisle 3 and vanished. What was in that bag would terrify the FBI. Short, cinematic, and punchy, the hook teases the link between a mundane setting and a national security threat. In 1907, just outside Pasadena, California, home of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a quiet neighborhood grocery store became the center of an espionage operation. It wasn't a hacker or a double agent in a lab coat. It was a Soviet operative using paper bags and cereal aisles to funnel sensitive satellite data directly to Moscow. And the way he got in? Through NASA's back door and America's blind spot. Tina Hall had worked at the register at Monterey Market for just under 2 years, and in that time, she'd memorized the rhythm of the store, the way traffic picked up on Saturday mornings with churchgoers, or dipped into silence midweek except for the lunch rush crowd looking for sandwiches and soda. She knew the regulars by face if not name, the elderly man who always bought 2 apples and a newspaper, the teenager who came in for gum and flirted awkwardly, the busy mothers wrangling toddlers with one hand and coupon books with the other. That's why the man in the blue windbreaker stood out. He didn't fit the tempo. Always Thursdays, always around 11:20 a.m. He'd enter through the side door by the floral section, walk slowly through produce, past the canned goods, and down the cereal aisle, never touching anything, never saying a word. His movements were so deliberate it gave Tina a chill. She watched him from the register as he stopped at the bottom shelf near the Raisin Bran and placed a brown paper bag tucked under his arm onto the tile floor. Then, as though he had suddenly remembered he was late for something, he exited quickly out of the same door, vanishing down the sidewalk. The first time, Tina thought maybe he was forgetful, someone leaving behind groceries by accident. But the next week, it happened again. Same man, same aisle, same bag. This time, she left her register briefly under the excuse of restocking receipt tape and walked the aisle just after he left. The bag was still there, brown, crumpled slightly at the top, sealed shut. She didn't touch it. 5 minutes later, while she was pretending to tidy the candy rack, a second man entered the store. Average height, late 30s, sunglasses indoors. He walked straight past the registers, didn't make eye contact, went directly to aisle 3, picked up the bag, and walked out. Not rushed, not hesitant, like he knew exactly where to go. She blinked, stunned. 2 weeks in a row. The third week, she was ready. Notebook tucked under the register, a small pair of opera glasses, her mother's, long unused, hidden under the counter. This time she jotted down details, the exact time the first man entered, the aisle, the clothes, the bag, the car he got into, a gray Oldsmobile with a rusted bumper and a dent in the rear left panel. No plates on the front, California tags on the back, 3NQ214. She wrote it down and waited. 20 minutes later, the second man appeared. Same glasses, same straight path, same pickup. This time, his car was parked in the alley behind the store. Black Pontiac, tinted windows, license plate 7KZ980. Tina wrote that down too. Her heart was thumping, her palms sweaty. Something was happening in aisle 3, something deliberate and hidden in plain sight. And whatever it was using her grocery store as a conduit. She didn't know what to do with that information yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to ignore it anymore. Tina didn't tell anyone at first, not even her co-workers, who she figured would either laugh or shrug, just like the manager had the one time she mentioned the Thursday bag man in passing. But after the third week of watching the silent exchange unfold in aisle 3, she knew she had to bring someone into it. That someone was her older brother, Eric Hall, a freshly discharged Air Force signals analyst who was back in Pasadena, living out of boxes and half-hearted job leads, trying to figure out civilian life after 8 years of radar screens and classified bunkers. He was skeptical at first, half smirking through his second cup of black coffee, as Tina described the weekly pattern, the bag, the quiet switch, the way it happened like clockwork. "Sounds like some weird stoner art project," he said, dismissing it with a chuckle. But she pressed on, showed him the notebook, the timestamps, the descriptions, and, finally, the plate numbers she'd started collecting. That gave him pause. He flipped through her notes, whistling low as he recognized the structural detail in her observations. "You did this like an ops log," he muttered, half impressed. "I learned from you," she said. So that Thursday, he borrowed her beat-up Corolla and parked 3 spots down from the gray Oldsmobile she'd marked the week before. He wore a Padres cap pulled low, sunglasses, and pretended to read a newspaper, glancing up occasionally as the bag drop took place exactly when she said it would. The man moved with mechanical precision, exiting the store within 90 seconds of entry. 10 minutes later, the second man arrived, tinted glasses, short dark hair, blue jacket, and picked up the bag without hesitation. Eric followed at a safe distance, noting how casually the man walked, like someone taking a lunch break. He tailed the black Pontiac as it weaved through side streets, never speeding, never doubling back, until it merged onto Arroyo Seco Parkway and eventually pulled into a secure parking lot marked Federal Access Only. Eric parked across the street, heart pounding. He knew this building. He'd been briefed on its existence during training, but never allowed near it. It was a NASA JPL auxiliary annex, supposedly handling data overflow, satellite diagnostics, and archival cataloging, but it also had top-tier security, barbed fencing, keycard-only entry, cameras on every angle. He watched as the man walked through the side entrance, swiped a badge, and disappeared inside without a glance back. Eric sat frozen, the newspaper slipping from his lap. Grocery bags, cereal aisles, dead drops. Those were spycraft basics, Cold War relics that were supposed to be buried with Berlin Wall rubble. But now? It was unfolding 5 miles from their childhood home. When he returned to Tina's apartment, he said nothing at first, just poured himself another coffee and stared out the window. Finally, he said, "You were right." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "This isn't just weird," he added quietly. "This is operational. You just stumbled into a live asset handoff." And with that, they both realized something heavy, something dangerous, was happening inside Monterey Market. Eric couldn't sleep that night, not with the image of the second man swiping his way into the NASA JPL annex still etched in his mind like a static shadow, and by morning he was already on the phone to an old Air Force buddy who now worked out of Vandenberg and owed him 2 favors and a bottle of scotch. "You ever heard of a guy named Mark Ivanoff?" Eric asked casually, spinning the name like it was gossip instead of suspicion. But the response on the other end was a pause that ran too long. "No one by that name in any DoD or NASA database I've got access to," his friend finally muttered, then added, "You sure you've got the name right?" Eric was sure. He'd watched the man flash his ID badge before disappearing into the restricted building, and he'd seen the faint print through binoculars. Mark Ivanoff. Eric pressed further, pulling in strings where he could, leaning on contacts from his analyst days, and soon learned that Ivanoff was listed in the JPL's internal directory as a Level 1 contractor, a janitorial temp, supposedly brought in through a civilian subcontractor called West Mountain Services. But when Eric tried to verify that contractor's government record, the digital trail went cold. No contracts filed, no website, just a disconnected number and a shell office address in North Hollywood that now housed a shuttered yoga studio. That was the first alarm bell. The second came when he contacted HR at JPL, posing as a journalist for a small aerospace trade magazine, and asked for a short backgrounder on Mark Ivanoff, the maintenance tech. The receptionist hesitated, transferred him 3 times, and finally someone read aloud from a file. Ivanoff's work history was on paper only, with no digital employment profile, no SSN on file, no emergency contact, no home address. Just a line that said, "Hired via subcontractor, clearance approved under exception code 4097B. Eric didn't need a database to recognize that code. It was reserved for foreign-born personnel with provisional access, typically flagged for special review, which meant whoever cleared him either hadn't done their job or had a reason not to. He checked DMV records next. No driver's license under that name in California, no vehicle registration. IRS database? Nothing. The man was a ghost, a name stitched into a system without a past. Eric shared everything with Tina in a quiet booth at a diner on Colorado Boulevard, passing her a notepad full of scribbled arrows, timelines, org charts with boxes circled in red. She stared at it, overwhelmed. "So, who is he?" she whispered. Eric shook his head. "Not who he says," he muttered. "Nobody this invisible is clean. Either he's running from something, or he's exactly where he's supposed to be, hiding in plain sight." They sat there for a long time, watching cars drift past the window. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it settle in the silence. This wasn't just about a grocery bag anymore. This was espionage, and someone had opened the back door to NASA. The decision wasn't made lightly, but once it was made, Tina and Eric both knew there was no going back. They were stepping over an invisible line, from observers to participants, and once they touched that bag, they couldn't unsee what they saw or unknow what they learned. It was Thursday morning when they put the plan into action, with Tina working her usual shift at Monterey Market and Eric parked 2 blocks away in a borrowed car, eyes hidden behind aviators, pulse a metronome of nerves. Tina's hands shook as she stocked shelves near aisle 3, pretending not to look up when the familiar figure in the windbreaker entered right on schedule, 11:19 a.m. He walked the same path, past bananas, past canned soup, turned the corner near the cereal, and knelt by the bottom shelf to place the folded brown paper bag like he was just adjusting stock. Then he was gone. Tina counted to 10, scanned the aisle, and with her heart thudding like it wanted to punch through her ribs, she bent down, snatched the bag, and stuffed it into her own tote hidden beneath a box of cleaning rags. She slipped into the back room, walked straight past the brake fridge and out at the rear employee exit where Eric was waiting. Engine running. "Drive," she whispered, not even buckled yet, and they pulled away just as the black Pontiac rolled into the parking lot. Inside the car, Eric opened the bag slowly, like it might explode. What they found wasn't groceries. It was a sealed manila envelope, tucked tight between 2 folded wax sandwich wrappers, and when Eric pulled it open, he swore under his breath. Inside were a dozen photographic prints, black and white, high contrast, clearly shot from microfilm. The images were grainy, but as Eric flipped through them, his stomach dropped. They weren't photos of maps or family vacations. They were documents, diagrams of satellite relay stations, frequency allocation charts, and what looked like internal NASA memos, some stamped with a red limited distro notice and watermarks that read JPL internal use only. One sheet appeared to be a decoding key, a chart for interpreting signal pulses, written in a precise hand with Cyrillic margin notes. Tina watched his face pale as he kept flipping. "This is bad," Eric said, almost to himself. "This is classified level bad." That night, after hours of debate, they drove the envelope across town to the FBI field office on Wilshire Boulevard. Tina held the bag like it was radioactive. At the front desk, they asked to speak to someone about potential espionage, and that changed everything. They were ushered into a private room, questioned for over an hour by 2 agents in Navy suits who asked sharp, clinical questions and took extensive notes. Eric laid everything out: names, times, plates, the connection to JPL. When the agents saw the documents, their demeanor shifted instantly from bored skepticism to alert calculation. "You did the right thing. Bringing this in," one agent finally said. "We'll take it from here." But Tina and Eric both knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. By the following Monday, a new car was parked in the Monterey Market lot, unmarked, nondescript, with tinted windows and an antenna that didn't quite match factory specs. And inside sat Special Agent Alan Rourke, a 14-year Bureau veteran who had worked Soviet espionage cases in Chicago, D.C., and Miami, but never expected to be deployed to a suburban grocery store in Pasadena, of all places. He wasn't alone. Over the next 72 hours, the FBI established a rolling surveillance team covering Tina Hall's store, the NASA JPL Annex, and the shadowy figure they now knew only as Mark Ivanov. 2 agents were stationed inside the market, rotating shifts dressed as retirees, delivery drivers, and overly enthusiastic couponers. Another car monitored the alley behind the store, with a telephoto lens trained on the lot. The pattern was immediate, precise, and unsettling. Every Thursday, at nearly the exact same minute, Ivanov arrived, placed the paper bag at the same spot on the bottom shelf in aisle 3, and left without ever touching a product. 15 to 20 minutes later, a second individual, never the same twice, retrieved the bag and exited. There was no contact, no conversation, no visible signal. It was textbook tradecraft, a brush pass with layered deniability. But what startled the agents most was how casually it was done, hidden in a public place no one would ever suspect. While half the surveillance team logged movements at the market, the other half tracked Ivanov's routines across the city, to a diner off Del Mar, a newsstand near El Molino, and, crucially to a squat beige apartment complex in Altadena with faded stucco and a view of the San Gabriel Mountains. The lease was in the name of Mark Ivanov, but again, no utility bills, no credit history, no digital record of his existence beyond the NASA paper file. Once they confirmed he had left for work one morning, agents obtained a covert entry warrant and spent 2 hours inside the apartment under the guise of a fire inspection notice slipped under the door. What they found made every hair on Rourke's neck stand up. The living room had been cleared of furniture except for a workbench covered in plastic sheeting, soldering tools, and scraps of circuit boards. In the bedroom, under blackout curtains, was a full analog darkroom setup. Red bulbs, chemical trays, drying lines with clips still stained from recent use. In the closet, hidden behind a false wall panel, agents discovered an array of amateur radio equipment. 2 transceivers, a tangle of coaxial cable, and an antenna feeder snaking out the window and masked under a fake window AC unit. On a corkboard were pages of handwritten ciphertext and strips of newspaper with letters circled, old-school cut-and-paste encryption straight out of a Cold War playbook. One agent whispered, "This guy's not pretending." Rourke just nodded grimly. The evidence wasn't speculative anymore. It was operational. Someone had rebuilt a spy cell inside the orbit of NASA using grocery bags, 35mm film, and silence. The name Ivanov was never meant to survive scrutiny, and once the FBI's counterintelligence unit began peeling it apart, it unraveled faster than anyone expected, revealing a trail that stretched far beyond Pasadena and deep into the frozen archives of Cold War espionage. Special Agent Rourke forwarded the alias to a small team in Washington that specialized in historical Soviet operations, men who spent their days buried in declassified cables, defector debriefs, and half-forgotten watch lists from the 1960s and early 70s. Within 48 hours, a match surfaced, not exact, but close enough to raise alarms. In a 1971 CIA defector report from West Germany, a radio engineer named Mikhail Ivanovich Orlov was mentioned in passing, described as highly intelligent, fluent in English, and trained at an advanced signal school in East Berlin, specializing in long-range transmission, burst communication, and low probability of intercept radio systems. Orlov had been attached to a Soviet technical delegation operating under civilian cover, but in late 1972, his name abruptly disappeared from official Soviet rosters. At the time, analysts assumed he had been recalled, reassigned, or quietly retired. Now, with the grocery store dead drops and the Altadena apartment full of radio gear, that assumption looked dangerously wrong. Further digging revealed that in early 1973, a man matching Orlov's physical description had entered Canada through Halifax using a forged Estonian passport under a different alias, claiming refugee status before vanishing into the interior of North America. No exit records, no asylum paperwork. Just a dead end until now. The Bureau compared photographs pulled from old East German surveillance files with the grainy DMV-style image attached to Ivanov's NASA badge, and the resemblance was undeniable. Same angular jaw, same slightly uneven eyes, same faint scar near the left ear. Rourke stared at the side-by-side prints in silence before, finally exhaling and saying, "He never left the war." The implications were severe. If Orlov had been active since the early 1970s, it meant the operation was long-term, patient, and deeply embedded, exactly the kind of asset Soviet intelligence prized most. This wasn't a desperate spy grabbing secrets on the fly. It was a professional who had waited years for the right access point. A man who understood that grocery stores, janitorial contracts, and anonymity were more valuable than high-level titles. The name was quietly added to a priority counterintelligence bulletin, flagged for interagency review, and circulated to NSA and CIA analysts under strict need-to-know protocols. Officially, Mark Ivanov still didn't exist. Unofficially, Mikhail Orlov had resurfaced, and the FBI now believed he was operating as a solo, deep-cover asset, transmitting American aerospace intelligence using techniques so old they'd become invisible. For Tina and Eric Hall, who were kept in the dark about the deeper identity for their own safety, all they knew was that the man who had walked through aisle 3 was no longer just suspicious. He was Soviet, and that realization shifted the case from strange to historic, from local to international, and from observation to an approaching confrontation that no one could stop once it had begun. The deeper the Bureau dug into Orlov's movements, the clearer the method became. And what shocked investigators wasn't the sophistication of his access, but how brilliantly ordinary it all was. Orlov, operating under the name Mark Ivanov, had never once requested computer credentials, clearance extensions, or direct access to classified servers within NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Instead, his entry point had been a third-party custodial contractor called West Mountain Services, the kind of generic, low-profile outfit that cycled through facilities unnoticed, invisible in plain sight. Contracted janitorial staff were allowed after-hours access to clean, restricted rooms, often without direct supervision, provided they passed a basic background check, which Orlov had done using his forged Estonian ID and a fabricated employment history that held up just long enough for paperwork to slip into the void of bureaucracy. Once inside, his job was simple: clean, clock out, and remain forgettable. But in practice, he was doing something else entirely. In secured document vaults and archiving rooms, many files still existed as physical prints, engineering schematics, orbital telemetry charts, and handwritten margin notes from technical staff. And these weren't always under lock and key. Orlov used a portable 35mm microfilm rig, no bigger than a lunchbox, modified with a side aperture and noise-dampened shutter. He'd sweep a conference room under the guise of emptying trash, then set the rig down under the table and slowly feed a document through the internal scanner while whistling a harmless tune. At home, he developed the negatives in his makeshift darkroom, using chemicals he sourced from a photography supply store on Sunset Boulevard, buying under a different name each time. Once developed, the images were trimmed into precise sizes and stored inside wax paper wraps that mimicked sandwich packaging. These were then sealed inside standard brown grocery bags and dropped, without a word, at the bottom shelf of aisle 3 in Monterey Market, always at 11:20 a.m. on Thursdays. The beauty of the system was in its deniability. The brush pass through indirect drop, a Soviet-era tradecraft technique refined over decades, was designed to keep asset and handler apart physically while maintaining a flow of information. The bag would sit for 10 to 15 minutes until retrieved by a rotating network of couriers, sometimes disguised as delivery men, sometimes elderly shoppers, who would exit without incident and disappear into the city. Orlov and his courier never met, never spoke, never acknowledged one another. The grocery store was chosen for its simplicity: public, crowded, boring. No one watches a supermarket shelf. The FBI, mapping out the entire chain across multiple surveillance operations, could only marvel at how effective the system had been. For nearly 2 years, top-level aerospace data had been flowing out of a 1999 bag of produce. And until Tina Hall noticed something off, no one had even realized it was happening. Orlov wasn't hacking servers, he was hacking routine. And it worked, spectacularly. It was the moment the FBI had been waiting for. Weeks of surveillance, hours of planning, and now the operation was set in motion with surgical precision. Thursday, 10:47 a.m., the air in Pasadena was dry and static, the kind of stillness that came before a storm. Agents were in place, 4 inside Monterey Market, scattered across aisles disguised as shoppers, one leaning on a cart of frozen peas, another flipping through coupons near the deli, their earpieces whispering quiet updates. Outside, 2 unmarked vans idled in opposite corners of the parking lot, each loaded with field techs monitoring every possible exit angle. The grocery bag this time was different, baited with fabricated documents designed to look sensitive but useless: mock satellite schematics, fake encryption protocols, and a forged interagency memo stamped confidential. Orlov's movements that morning were right on schedule. He left his apartment in Altadena at 10:53 a.m., took his usual route southbound on Lincoln Avenue, and was spotted by surveillance teams as he passed the first checkpoint. The plan was for him to perform the drop as always, leave the bag at aisle 3, and let the courier retrieve it. Except this time, the courier was also an agent. But something was off. Just before reaching the grocery store, Orlov took an unexpected left, cutting across Hill Street and accelerating toward the freeway on-ramp. Agents scrambled to reroute. 2 tails followed as he merged onto the 110 South, weaving through midday traffic with deliberate calm. No sudden moves, no panic, just a man who had altered his routine. For the next hour, he drove straight, through South Central, past Carson, through the industrial maze of Long Beach. At 12:14 p.m., he parked his car in a lot near Terminal D at the Port of Long Beach, stepped out, and vanished. By the time ground teams arrived at the scene, the vehicle was cold, keys still in the ignition, and the dock manifest confirmed the worst. Suspicion. A Soviet-flagged merchant vessel, the Raduga, had departed just 18 minutes earlier, bound for Vladivostok via the Panama Canal. It had requested expedited clearance and moved without delay. The Bureau scrambled, calls to naval intelligence, port authorities, even diplomatic channels, but it was already too late. The Raduga was in open waters, its course legal, its paperwork airtight. Orlov had slipped the net. Every agent involved in the sting sat in stunned silence as the realization sank in. They'd been made. Somehow, he'd known. Whether through an unnoticed surveillance breach, an intercepted signal, or simply an instinct honed over decades, Orlov had smelled the trap and walked away before it could spring. In the fluorescent stillness of the FBI's LA field office, the failed sting felt like a gun misfiring in a moment of perfect aim. Rourke stood in front of the operations board, tracing his finger along the line of Orlov's last known path. The silence, around him thick with frustration. "He's gone," someone whispered behind him, but Rourke knew better. "No," he said, almost to himself. "He's finished the job." And the room fell quiet again. In '93, nearly 15 years after Orlov vanished into the Pacific fog aboard a Soviet merchant vessel, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible when Tina Hall first noticed a paper bag resting on a grocery store shelf. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the Berlin Wall had been dismantled stone by stone, and Western intelligence agencies were suddenly awash in a flood of documents. Declassified archives, defectors turned informants, and boxes of brittle, yellowing files from KGB offices abandoned in the chaos of regime change. In a nondescript building outside Langley, Virginia, an analyst named Patrick Reese stumbled on a file labeled Petros, California, 1975 to 78, while cataloging a newly obtained microfilm reel from a former GRU field station in Minsk. It was thin, just 17 pages, but what it revealed hit like a thunderclap. Petros, it turned out, had been one of the KGB's most disciplined deep-cover assets. His mission, embed himself within American aerospace infrastructure and extract technical data critical to Soviet orbital parity. The report outlined Petros's infiltration of a NASA-affiliated contractor in Southern California via a contractual sanitation intermediary, a phrase that perfectly matched the West Mountain Service's custodial entry Orlov had used. But it was the operational method that made Reese sit forward in his chair. Information transmission conducted through routine tradecraft, indirect drop points inside civilian American food markets, preference noted for grocery stores near government installations, reliability of method confirmed over 28 transmissions, risk index minimal, operation considered success. The final page included a grainy, poorly lit photograph. No name, no location, just a man walking out of a supermarket carrying a brown paper bag. The caption read, "Petros departing Site C, May 1977. A notation at the bottom confirmed that the agent had been awarded the Order of the Dissel, Red Banner, one of the highest honors in Soviet military intelligence, for exemplary execution of a Tier 4 foreign collection mission. The Bureau would later confirm, through overlapping asset reports, that Site C referred to Monterey Market in Pasadena, and the agent codenamed Petros was almost certainly Mikhail Ivanovich Orlov. Tina Hall, now working as a security consultant for a private aerospace firm, received a quiet call from her old contact in the FBI, who told her, without official acknowledgement, that her instincts had been right all along. Eric, now a father of 2 and living in Arizona, received the same call. There would be no public recognition, no medals, no feature in the Sunday paper. But for a brief moment, history had turned on a bag of photos in a cereal aisle, and 2 civilians had stood in the middle of a spy war that most Americans never even knew was happening. In the end, the file on Petros was stored in a classified annex under case designator XJ611, quietly cross-referenced with FBI Case 702D and a short internal NASA memo that read, in part, "Security revisions implemented, system vulnerabilities resolved, threat profile acknowledged." But none of it would undo what had already been passed. The Cold War had many battlefields, but Isle 3 was among the strangest and most quietly devastating of them all. When the Soviet Union finally fractured under the weight of its own contradictions in the early 90s, the collapse did not arrive with clarity so much as debris, and buried in that debris were truths that had been carefully hidden for decades, waiting for someone to piece them together. Among the thousands of intelligence files pried loose from abandoned KGB archives was a slim, meticulously typed dossier stamped Soversheno Sekretno, top secret, bearing a single operational code name, Petros. The file was unremarkable in size but chilling in content. According to internal memoranda dated between 1975 and 1978, Petros was a deep-cover technical asset assigned to the United States with one objective: penetrate American aerospace infrastructure without attracting attention, extract high-value technical data, and vanish without compromise. The documents described his insertion into California under a falsified Baltic identity, his deliberate choice to avoid high-level, scientific positions, and his strategic decision to embed himself through a custodial subcontractor to gain physical access rather than digital clearance. The tradecraft section was explicit and almost clinical in its admiration, detailing how Petros avoided electronic interception entirely by relying on analog methods, 35 microfilm, chemical development, and handwritten cipher fragments, and how information transfers were conducted using what the KGB described as low-risk civilian exchange nodes, clarified in a footnote as Amerikansky Продовольственные magazini, American grocery stores. One passage noted with dry satisfaction that the chosen drop site was consistently ignored by counterintelligence due to its mundane nature and high civilian traffic, a phrase that years later would be underlined in red by a CIA analyst reading it in disbelief. The reports confirmed that over 24 successful transfers had occurred, all without direct contact between asset and courier, and that the material obtained included deep space telemetry parameters, satellite imaging calibration data, and early orbital correction algorithms that were later integrated into Soviet reconnaissance and navigation programs. The final evaluation labeled the operation an unequivocal success. Petros had not been captured, interrogated, or compromised. He had exited U.S. territory legally aboard a merchant vessel and returned to Soviet control without incident. For his work, the file stated, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, a decoration reserved for exceptional service to the state, presented quietly in a closed ceremony to preserve his anonymity even within intelligence circles. Nowhere in the file was his real name listed, only a single photograph attached at the end, grainy and partially obscured, showing a man stepping through the automatic doors of a supermarket, a brown paper bag tucked casually under his arm. When Western intelligence agencies cross-referenced the Petros file with long-dormant FBI and NASA incident reports, the pieces finally aligned. The unexplained security retrofits, the vanished contractor, the grocery store surveillance logs. The case that had never been officially solved now had a conclusion, though not a satisfying one. There were no arrests to make, no trials to hold, no public reckoning. The Cold War had ended not with a confession, but with a footnote. And for those who had unknowingly stood inches from history while shopping for cereal, the revelation carried a quiet, unsettling truth. Sometimes the most damaging espionage operations in history don't unfold in shadowy alleyways or secret labs, but under fluorescent lights, between aisle signs, where no one thinks to look. If you found this story as chilling as it is fascinating, subscribe for more untold Cold War secrets that were hiding in plain sight. And remember, sometimes the front line of espionage isn't in a battlefield or a boardroom, it's the cereal aisle.